Unfortunately, this so-called spirit began to show an alarming tendency to do what I said it couldn't do. Become personal. Worse still, it seemed to be taking up the offensive. I remember I was going up Headington Hill on a bus, and I was aware of a sensation in which I was holding something at bay, as though I was shutting something out. And I realized there was a choice: to open the door or to shut it. A little while later, only moments later, I realized I had made that choice. I had opened the door. And I finally had admitted that God was God. That night I knelt down and prayed for the first time in a long time, probably the most reluctant and maybe even dejected supplicator in all of England. But though I had admitted that God was God, I hadn't yet admitted that Christ was Christ. However, I did say that the Spirit was on the offensive. One night, I invited Tollers and a man named Hugo Dyson to dine with me at Magdalen. Dyson is a philosopher. He's a devoutly religious man, and he has a love of the truth. He's also a man that gives you the impression of being made of quicksilver. Now, I mean this in the positive sense. He pours himself into a room in a cataract of words and gestures, and you are caught up in the stream. After the first plunge, it's exhilarating. Well, after we had dined, we took a walk through the Magdalen grounds, and I happened to remark to Tollers that I still viewed the story of Christ as just another myth. Well, that set Tollers off. Jack, he said, in a way I agree with you. As you know, I believe that all mythology contains some fragments of eternal truth. But the story of Christ is fundamentally different. You see, the poet who invented this myth was God himself. And the whole myth is absolute truth, and the myth actually happened at a precise point in human history. Well, I said, Tollers, that's a little hard to accept. Jack, he said, you amaze me. He said, when you meet sacrifice in a pagan story, you don't mind it at all. In fact, you rather like it. You only dislike it when you meet it in the Gospels. He was right, of course. And I did love the story of Boulder. And he said, why can't you transfer your appreciation of that story to the story of Christ, the life and death of Christ? Well, by the time Tollers had finished, it was 3 a.m. in the morning. And so he left. And then the second phase of the offensive kicked in. Hugo Dyson, who spent the next hour telling me how he'd become a Christian and how important his relationship with Jesus Christ was. Tollers left me at 4 a.m. and my mind was in a whirl. So many thoughts rushing through. And then I realized it had come to a point where it was a matter of belief, not logical proof. I also realized that for far too long I had let my rational side dominate my emotions. Not long after that, I went from believing in God to definitely believing in Christ. I came to see that God became man for no other purpose than to secure man's salvation. The centerpiece of Christianity is the story of that one grand miracle, that he who is beyond space and time, who is uncreated, eternal, came into nature, came into human nature, descended into his own universe, died and rose, bringing up nature with him. And now that I had come to this point, I was determined to accept the traditional doctrines of Christianity. I did not want to argue about them. I did not want to reinterpret them. I simply wanted to defend them. And that's why I wrote most of my books. To the extent that some people have dubbed me rather dubiously, I think, as a Christian apologist. I must say the term sits very uneasily on my shoulders. Indeed, there are many times when I feel very much unlike a Christian apologist. Not like a Christian apologist at all. Probably more like an apology for a Christian. Anyway, I always find that apologetic work is somewhat dangerous to one's own faith. Sometimes a doctrine never seems dimmer to me than when I've just successfully defended it. And that's when I repair to the apologist's prayer. From all my lame defeats and oh much more, from all the victories I seem to score, from cleverness shot forth on thy behalf, at which, while angels weep, the audience laugh. From all my proofs of thy divinity, thou, who dost need no proof, deliver me. The one thing I was determined when I became a Christian, that unlike my childhood version, this should be no wishy-washy affair. It shouldn't be only on Sundays. Putting on Christ is not a special exercise that one does on a special day. It is the whole of Christianity. Christianity offers nothing else at all. I am sometimes intrigued by people who want to use Christianity as a convenience. Do you know that in World War II, the churches, which had been previously half empty, were so full on Sundays that you could hardly get a seat? People choosing to believe because it suits them, Charles used to say. We've all been guilty of that, Jack. Dear Charles. When he descended on Oxford, it was with such commentary blaze. Charles Williams, a man whose lectures were so celebrated that you could hardly get a seat there as well. Lectures delivered without a single note, perfectly coherent, and delightfully peppered with quotations in his incantatory manner. I shall never forget a lecture that he gave on chastity. Simply as criticism, it was superb. For here was a man who cared with every fiber of his being for that serious doctrine of virginity. It was a beautiful sight to see a room full of young men and young women spellbound, sitting in that absolute silence that cannot be faked. I had at last, if only for once, seen a university doing what it was intended to do and founded to do, teaching wisdom. Speaking of World War II and the increased interest in Christianity, even the BBC got in on the act. They asked me if I would do a series of talks on the basics of Christianity. They even said they thought it might help boost morale. Well, I agreed, and the first series that I did I felt were a complete failure. But I consoled myself with the fact that I wasn't the first ass that God had used, and probably wouldn't be the last. I did 3 series in all, and no one, certainly not I, realized how popular they would become. Oh, whether they boosted the British morale, I cannot say. I do know this, that my publisher urged me to edit them into a book. It's ironic, really. But for the Second World War, I doubt that Mere Christianity would have ever been published. Oh, now I can see what you're thinking. You're thinking, this author is not to be trusted. He said he wasn't going to speak about his books or how he wrote them. Well, now that I've transgressed, I might as well do it again. During World War II, we were constantly bombarded with German propaganda broadcasts that cut through our regular programming. Couldn't do anything about it. And one day, one of these propaganda broadcasts came through, and it was Hitler. And I jumped up to turn it off, obviously. And as I got to the radio, I stopped. I was stunned by the power of his oratory. It was compelling. Of course, I did turn it off in the end. The next Sunday, I was coming out of church, and I was reflecting on this incident and the fact that we as Christians face a very compelling enemy. And then it struck me. I came up with an idea to write a book that would look at the psychology of temptation only from the other point of view. And that book was called The Screwtape Letters. And it went on to be one of my most successful books ever. Do you know what? It even landed me on the front cover of Time magazine. September 1947. Did any of you see it? No? Oh, well, you haven't missed much. Charles, by the way, was asked to write a review on Screwtape in one of the magazines. I forget which one. I won't tell you whether he wrote good or ill of it. I will tell you how he finished his review. It went like this. Dear Scorpuscle, I hate this book, this heavenly book. It's heavenly dangerous. This giveaway of hell. Your friend, Snicksozzle. P.S. You will send someone to see after Lewis, some very clever fiend. Oh, by the way, when I read the first few chapters of Screwtape to Tollers, he was very unenthusiastic. He thought I was playing with fire, but I was determined that he should read it all. But how could this be achieved? Tollers can be a very stubborn man if he wants to. And then it struck me. I know how I can get him to read it. I'll dedicate the book to him. Well, I want to go and see if I can find Warney. I want to make a cup of tea for you, and I think he might be at Richard's, so I'm going to go and give a quick call. While I'm gone, why don't you stretch your legs? You'll find some conveniences around. I think you call them restrooms. How odd. I can't think of any room least likely to afford a good rest. Well, if you give me a couple of minutes, I'll be back in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. Anybody seen Warney? Well, I phoned Richard and he's not there. I don't know where he could have got to. I know where he's gone to. He's always doing this on me. He stopped off at the pub for a pint of beer. I have to watch him, you know. Sometimes rather overdoes it. But I think he's a little better now that he's recognized that he's got a problem. There's a self-deprecating air about it. He's always trotting out this little poem. Quite humorous, I always think. And I don't know whether I can remember it. I'll do my best. How does it go now? 'Twas an evening in November, as I very well remember. I was walking down the street in drunken pride. My knees were all aflutter, so I lay down in the gutter. And a pig came up and lay down by my side. As I lay there in the gutter, thinking thoughts I ought not utter, a lady passing by was heard to say, "You can tell a man who boozes by the company he chooses." And the pig got up and slowly walked away. Don't tell Warney I told you, will you? It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of an angry BPB. Well, I've told you a little bit about my childhood. Told you a little bit about my education. Told you a little bit of how I became a Christian. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about my wife. As I say, she died 3 years ago. But first we must go back to 1950, the year that The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe was published. I've always received a lot of correspondence from people who have read my books, and I always make a point to answer every one of them. Warney helps me in this endeavor. He can use a typewriter, I can't. Even if I could, I would stick to handwriting. I think it's far more personal. Still, I suppose typewriters are here to stay. Anyway, one day we had an unusually large postbag, and partly because there were a lot of letters from America. So I said, well, Warner, you take the English ones and I'll take the American ones. The first letter I opened was from a Mrs. Joy Gresham. And though she and I had never met, and it was the first letter I'd had from her, she wrote as if she knew me. I mentioned this to Warney, and he said, well, that's really par for the course for Americans, Jack. I said, what do you mean it's par for the course? He said, well, they give the impression that they know you. They're far too friendly. I said, Warney, I think we English can do with a little bit of this American friendliness. He said, well, you can have my portion, Jack. Well, as I knew this conversation was clearly going nowhere, I returned to my letter, and I was very impressed with her perceptiveness and her wit. So impressed that I wrote back immediately. Not long after that, I got a letter back from her, and once again, I was in awe of her perception. Well, to cut a long story short, we began a regular correspondence, and after 2 years, I got a letter from her to say that she was coming to England. She had been unwell and was looking for a period of convalescence, and she had some friends in London she hadn't seen for a long time, and so she thought she'd kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Actually, 3 birds, because she intimated that she would like to meet with me. I mentioned this to Warney, and I said, I think I'll invite her for lunch, Warney. Careful, Jack, he said. I don't know what you're worried about, Warney, I said. She won't bite. Well, then I wouldn't order much lunch if she won't bite, Jack, he said. Warney can be very droll at times. Anyway, I did invite her for lunch, and she came up, and we had lunch in my tutorial rooms at Magdalen College. I've invited a few of my colleagues along. I was wondering how she would get on in this male bastion, but she seemed very comfortable and acquitted herself well in conversation. I wondered how she would get on being the only woman amongst a number of men, but she seemed extraordinarily uninhibited. She turned to Roger and said, is there anywhere in this monastic establishment where a lady can relieve herself? The bursar nearly laid an egg. Well, after the lunch was over, I thought I'd give her the tuppenny halfpenny tour of the college. And that's what I did. And the tour went swimmingly well until we bumped into Christopher. Christopher is a bit of a cynic and has a rather jaundiced view of women. He never loses an opportunity to get a dig in when he can. Mind you, I thought even he was sailing close to the wind when he intimated that when men got together, their conversation tended to be driven by the intellect, and when women got together, their conversation tended to be driven by emotion. I shall never forget her reply. Professor Humphreys, she said, I can't do the American accent, so I won't insult you. Professor Humphreys, she said, in order to make a valued judgment about feminine conversation, you would have to experience it in an exclusive environment. To do that, you would need to change your gender. That would require you to have an operation which I, for one, would oppose on the grounds that feminine nobility would be markedly diminished. That sent him packing. Well, I put her back on the train to London with quite a bit of regret and with the hope that we would one day meet again. She went back to London, then of course back to America. But I didn't get the letter that I was expecting. And I thought, oh, that's it. Now that she's met me, the bubble has burst. Warney was in agreement. So I don't know why you're surprised, Jack. Once you have met the object of your esteem, the fantasy element disappears, evaporates, and you are left with the reality. In your case, a rather plump, middle-aged man. Thank you, Warney, I said. Well, a few months later, I did get a letter from her, and it became apparent why she hadn't written. She had gone back to America only to find that her husband had taken a mistress, and that mistress was now installed in the home. Of course, he was very magnanimous. He said that Joy could have the spare room if she wanted. And of course, she was very distraught. She wrote to me asking me for any advice, even though she assumed that from my writings I was against divorce. Well, I wrote back to her and said that I urged her to consider divorce only as a last resort. It wasn't so much that I was against divorce as that I am for marriage, however defective the institution might sometimes appear. She also asked whether I thought that divorce was acceptable in the eyes of God. And again, I wrote back to her and said that from my understanding of Scripture, divorce is acceptable in only one circumstance, and that of adultery. And that if her husband wouldn't give up this adulterous liaison, then I did not think that our Lord would view her seeking or getting a divorce as a sin. Though I did point out that some of his official representatives down here might take a rather less lenient view. Well, she went silent on me again. Quite a long time this time. And then the phone rang, and it was Joy. And after we exchanged a few niceties, she said, "You'll never guess, Jack." I said, "Guess what?" She said, "You'll never guess where I'm living." I said, "Don't tell me, you've moved to Narnia." "No, Jack," she said, "try London." I said, "London? London, England?" She said, "Yes, Jack, you don't object, do you?" Well, I said, "No, it's not a matter of objecting, but what about your husband?" "My ex-husband," she said. It transpired that her husband would not give up this mistress, and so she had little alternative but to file for divorce, and after she'd done that, she wanted to get her and her two boys as far away from that situation as possible. Well, I suppose 4,000 miles is a fairly safe distance. Well, now that she was ensconced in a London apartment, we struck up our correspondence again. I never visited her in London, mainly for two reasons. Firstly, I find the pace of life in our capital city very disagreeable. Secondly, Warney made it very clear that he did not think it was a good idea for a middle-aged bachelor and an Oxford don at that to be visiting a divorcee, and an American one at that. So we just continued with our correspondence. Well, I did manage in the end to persuade Warney that we should invite her and the two boys to stay with us in Oxford. Can you imagine a couple of crusted old bachelors trying to keep up with two American boys whose energy seems inexhaustible? During those few days, I took Joy on a walk through the village. And as we were going up one street, we happened to notice that there was a house up for rent. The next door neighbour happened to be in her garden, and so we asked her whether she knew what the rent was, and she said, "Well, it's about £20 a month." Well, Joy's mouth dropped open. She said, "That's half of what I'm paying in London." So I'm not surprised, Joy. London is very expensive. In fact, everything in London is expensive. Rents, food, the lot. Well, she said, "Perhaps I should move up here." I said, "Well, you'd save a lot of money." And she said, "Oh, yes, and postage." I said, "I'm not with you, Joy." She said, "Well, if I'm up here, maybe we could visit instead of write." And I'm sure the neighbours will have something to say about that. Well, to cut a long story short, she did come to Headington and moved into that house. And I must say that as a short walk would have me on her doorstep, the weekly letters really became a weekly visit. Warney was unimpressed, of course. I was going out one day and he said, "You know what people are saying, don't you, Jack?" I said, "No, Warney, I don't know what they're saying because they're not saying it to me." "That doesn't mean they're not saying it, Jack." I said, "Saying what, Warney?" He said, "I don't know, they're not saying it to me either." I said, "Look, Warney, if they're not saying what they're saying to you and they're not saying what they're saying to me, how do we know what they are saying?" He said, that's not the point, Jack. I said, it's precisely the point. Anyway, I don't see why a man can't have a lady friend. Oh, he said, Jack, lady friends are all right, but you do realize that they have other functions, don't you? I said, Warnie, without those other functions, we wouldn't be having this ridiculous conversation. I said, but now that you've mentioned it, I'll investigate the possibilities and report back to you. That soon shut him up. Well, when I was with her, the other function was never even an issue. We were generally locked in debate. She was as good a debater as any man friend I had ever had. She put me in mind of a certain Miss Anscombe, but we won't go there. Joy had a mind that was lithe and quick, and muscular as a leopard. I soon learned not to talk rot to her. Well, I suppose you could say that a certain platonic status quo had settled in, and would have remained so but for an enormous brushstroke across fate's canvas. One night when I went to visit her and she opened the door, I could see she'd been crying. And she was a very independent woman, so that when she fell into my arms sobbing, I realized something was seriously wrong. And then I noticed she was clutching a letter. It was from the British government, and they had informed her that they would not renew her visa, that she and the boys should make arrangements to leave the country and go back to America, and if they didn't do that, they would be deported. Obviously, she was distraught, and she didn't want to uproot the boys and take them back to America, and she was very worried about them coming under the influence of their father. So I said, look, Joy, I'm sure we can fight this. I'll talk to my solicitor. I think you call them lawyers. I'll talk to my solicitor, I said, and let's see if we can challenge it. She said, oh, Jack, she said, I can't afford legal fees. I said, don't worry, I can cover that. She said, oh, I can't take your money, Jack. I said, I wish the tax man would take such a noble stance. Well, we tried, but we failed. The British government wouldn't budge. And I felt very sorry for her. Then one night I was lying in bed. And I had remembered that my solicitor had said that there was one circumstance that would ensure she could stay in the country. So I had a little chat to myself. That's very dangerous. Jack, I said, you're a middle-aged man with little prospect of marriage. According to Warnie, you're a plump middle-aged man with no prospect of marriage. So it'd hardly be a sacrifice if you married her so that she could stay in the country. Well, the next night I went round to see her, and I was sitting a little nervously because I'd never done this sort of thing before. In the end, I just blurted it out. I said, marry me, Joy, and you can stay in the country. Well, there was an awkward silence, and then she said, I'm not that desperate, Jack. That was a reaction to break the tension, and we both laughed. I said to her, of course, it would be a marriage of convenience. There'd be no question of the other stuff. And she said, it's called sex, Jack. I said, I know, but I find it very hard to use that word in front of a woman. She said, oh, well, at least if I marry you, I'll be safe. Well, I said, think about it, but don't think too long. The wheels of government grind slowly, but they do grind. A few days later, she phoned me and she said, I've been thinking about your offer, Jack. It's very kind, very gracious, and I will accept. The die was cast. My only problem was telling Warnie. The day I did remains forever burnt in my memory. We were sitting in the garden. It was a sunny Sunday afternoon, and we were reading. Now, Warnie and I have known each other so long that we have managed to be able to get to the point where we can both be reading and still indulge in a shallow conversation. And such was the case that afternoon. All the while, I was trying to figure out a way how I could raise the subject, when lo and behold, he raised it himself. What's happened to the visa, Jack? Oh, I said, the British government said no. Oh, he said, I'm not surprised.